Does 2023 already have its fight of the year? Well, even if we do get a better fight over the coming months, few matchups in UFC history have produced the goods quite like this super fight between the pound-for-pound number 1 and number 2. Here's what some of the sport's biggest names had to say about Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski.
It's time!
Brian Ortega had the privilege of sharing the octagon with two of the fighters featured in UFC 284 title fights, Alexander Volkanovski and Yair Rodriguez. And as he tuned in to watch the event live, T-City expressed how grateful he is to have had that experience. Sure, he didn't get his hand raised in there with the undisputed or interim featherweight champion, but there's no denying that Ortega's place within the top 5 is secure as he recovers from his shoulder injury. Let's just hope he can find his way back to the octagon soon. Israel Adesanya can usually be counted on to give a live reaction to any major UFC event, but this time he didn't do so from the comfort of his couch through his YouTube channel. No, as a good friend and training partner of Alexander Volkanovski, Izzy, along with the likes of Kai Kara-France and Dan Hooker, were cage-side watching the madness of the UFC 284 main event unfold. We all know that the last stylebender is a pretty calm and chill dude, but during the fight he could barely stand still. Some fighters will tell you that watching their friends compete is far more stressful than any fight of their own. And just one look at Israel during that lightweight title fight will tell you everything you need to know. In the end, Adesanya and his team were left disappointed by the judge's decision. But in a fight that close, there are no real losers, right? Nate Diaz is always liable to take shots at his fellow fighters, especially if they do their business around his old division at 155 pounds. And when the UFC 284 main event came to its end, he was quick to offer his congratulations to the fighter he believed had won the contest, Alexander Volkanovski. In the Diaz world, fights are not scored on points or positional control. No, Nate and his brother Nick prefer a more visceral scoring system. And sure enough, before the scores were tallied up, Nate already knew who deserved the win. So when Islam Makhachev took home the victory, Diaz was not buying it. The two actually have a history, when their teams collided during the infamous World Series of Fighting brawl back in 2015, and when Volk seemingly did enough to take home the win but still lost, Nate used the opportunity to take a dig at his rival. Islam was actually asked about Nate's reaction during the post-fight press conference, but was pretty dismissive of the former UFC veteran, questioning just how sober he was when he made the tweet. Our guess? Not very, but that doesn't mean he was wrong. Charles Oliveira may have made a name for himself as one of the most dangerous and talented finishers the sport has ever known. But when he stepped in there against Islam Makhachev, the Dagestan wrestler's game was just too much for him. And from the opening bell, the wild and wonderful way of fighting that brought him to the top of the sport just didn't seem to be there. It was a dominant win for Islam, something that made what Alexander Volkanovski was able to do that bit more impressive. Oliveira was seen offering his congratulations to Islam post-fight, and while he will no doubt be working hard to get back in there with the champ, these two have always had a high level of respect for one another. For now, it seems as though Do Bronx will have to contend with Beneil Dariush next, which is no walk in the park. It goes without saying that this lightweight division is beyond stacked. Henry Cejudo posted a live stream of him and his friends watching the fight as it unfolded. Triple C is of course a member of Dominance MMA, and as a result shares the same manager as Islam, so it's clear that he was certainly pulling for the Dagestan champion as he watched it. But overall, despite Makhachev's win, it was clearly Volkanovski's performance that left the biggest impression. Cejudo has never been opposed to taking shots at Volk, calling him Alexander the Average in the past, but after a showing like that, all jokes went out of the window. Cejudo couldn't help but give props to the featherweight champion for his confidence in there against Makhachev. A lot of these fighters bit themselves before they even step into the cage with a guy like Islam, focusing too heavily on what could go wrong instead of making their own game work. Volkanovski actually took the fight to Islam, and though he didn't quite get the judge's nod, who can deny him the moral victory? Daniel Cormier was quoted as saying that if Alexander Volkanovski managed to beat Islam, it would be the biggest upset in UFC history. Now, of course, this is a longtime friend and training partner of Islam, and as a result, he should be expected to have at least some level of bias. But after watching just how well Volk did in there, Cormier made it clear that Alexander deserves his pound-for-pound king status. And while it would be very unlikely if the rankings didn't actually move Makhachev up to number 1, the fans would understand. Even Islam's most passionate supporters could not ignore what Volkanovski did in there. The featherweight champion might have to return to his home division before making another run at 155 pounds. But any doubts about his ability to be competitive as a lightweight have now completely vanished. Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping couldn't help but bring things into a broader perspective post-fight at the ARC arena, reminding us all why fights like this are why we love MMA in the first place. Bisping gave credit to both men for their ability to surprise each other and all of us with their well-roundedness. Most people were fairly confident in the prediction that Islam would dominate on the mat and Volkanovski would dominate on the feet, but what we got in the end was a truly well-balanced showdown. Bisping, for one, already seems is gearing up for the rematch. If Islam Makhachev and Alexander Volkanovski were to sign a contract for an immediate rematch, who would your prediction side with this time? Hasbullah. We could not ignore one of Team Makhachev's biggest supporters, the viral sensation Hasbullah. And in the immediate aftermath of the fight, he gave his congratulations to Islam directly before extending it to both fighters, calling the bout an all-timer. Yeah, we tend to agree with that sentiment, Hasbullah. Khabib Nurmagomedov. Khabib Nurmagomedov was not present at UFC 284, preferring instead to spend time with his family after stepping away from the sport of MMA. But to say that his presence was felt during this event would be putting it lightly. And once his pupil emerged from the contest with his hard-fought victory, the Eagle took to his official Instagram to congratulate his great friend. In his eyes, Makhachev had just gotten the better of the best active fighter on the planet, which, when you stop and think about it, is high praise for Volkanovski. Islam himself seems to understand that he still has work to do, especially while standing in the shadow of Khabib's perfect MMA run. But for now, a win over the pound-for-pound king is one hell of a feather in his cap. Alexander Volkanovski. Alexander Volkanovski was incredibly humble in the wake of the first UFC defeat. It almost feels strange to call it a defeat, because in reality, the headlines that emerged from this matchup on Sunday morning were predominantly focused on just how well the 145-pound king was able to do. A lot of his fellow fighters and MMA analysts wrote him off, and now it's clear that Volk managed to take home a moral victory. And when he was asked about the fight's result, despite having an argument to make, he instead made it clear that the bout was too close to be angry about. He also admitted that he underestimated Makhachev's striking, just as Islam may have underestimated his grappling and wrestling. He might lose his pound-for-pound number 1 status when the rankings are updated, but that's a modern-day great of the sport, folks. Islam Makhachev. Islam Makhachev managed to do just enough in pivotal rounds, taking home a very narrow and divisive unanimous decision victory. He showed himself to be a much better striker than many analysts had given him credit for. And though some of the mystique over his imposing wrestling game may have softened, we now know that this dude is as well-rounded as they come. Post-fight, Makhachev seemed proud of the fact that he can now definitively call himself the pound-for-pound best fighter on the planet. And though he was initially full of respect for Volkanovski, he didn't shy away from taking a dig at him in the hours that followed. On his rewatch of the fight, according to Islam, he can now admit that he did in fact lose the final minute of the 25. It's just about as tongue-in-cheek a comment as you will ever hear. But if one thing is for certain, it's that if these two future Hall of Famers win their next fights, there will be some real demand to see their super fight run back. Let's keep our fingers firmly crossed for that to become a reality.